I started studying astrology with the objective of analyzing my own horoscope. I was curious and interested to know what this subject had to talk about the Muhurat of the time that I was born in. During the process of my study and over the years as I spent studying this, I realized that the framework or the process that I need to follow in order to analyze my own horoscope is actually the same to analyze anyone else's horoscope. I also began to understand the role of Vedic Jyotish much better in our day-to-day life and began to appreciate that its utility far outweighs the most popular reason for using astrology, which is to make predictions of the future. The idea of this video and the subsequent video on the series is to teach the student, that is you, how to begin the process of analyzing a chart. I will make the assumption that you are an absolute beginner in the subject, and therefore we will start off right with the basics. So step 1 is obviously going to a website in which you can generate your horoscope. There are many such websites available on the platform. One such that I use is vedichoro.com. Actually, I have a paid version of this website. It allows me to create a database of charts, and since I also practice astrology, and this is very useful for me because I need to save charts of people that I work with. So here you can see the price that they have mentioned for subscription of the premium version, which is $22 for the year or approximately $40 for 2 years. There are other paid websites as well, for example Jagannath Hora, Parasha's Light, etc. But they are much more expensive, and they are generally used by far more sophisticated astrologers who are looking to study something in significant detail. I think for 99% of the world audience, this will actually suffice. So how do we begin with the process? Here you will just enter any random name. For example, I'm writing a test name, and just for the purpose of assessment, I will give today's date, that is 15th of Feb 2025, and the time as of now, which is 08:05 am. The place at which I am making this video is Pune, so I'll give the coordinates of this place and I'll simply use calculate. Now once I use calculate, we are going to come to a screen which looks like this. Here are the details, that is the sample that we have entered, the date of birth, time of birth, and the place of birth, which is captured in the latitude and longitude, and we are typically given a chart which looks like this. And they obviously have multiple options which I will go through over a period of time with you. But for the purpose of this video, I'm going to first teach you how to analyze the chart that is in front of us. That is, how do we even begin with the process of analyzing the kundali, so to speak. So to make this more useful and relevant for beginners, I am going to select the first house, and choose the zodiac which corresponds with Aries. The reason is because at this point I'm going to try to teach you the 12 houses of the horoscope, or the kundali as we say it. So we have to remember the position of this house. So where the cursor is moving, this house represents house number 1. Similarly, this house this house here represents house number 2. This is 3, 4, 5, and all the way up to 12. So once again, this house represents house number 1, just like this house represents house number 10. And so that you can remember this, I have selected the zodiac Aries in the location of the first house. Alright, now what do I mean by this? For example, let me just alter the setting a bit and make this the first house. Now here you will note that this continues to remain the first house, but this is represented by the number 2, which means that the first house in this case is that of a Taurus ascendant. So I'll come back to the initial position. So once again, you must remember the order of these houses. They're counted anti-clockwise and they will necessarily be 12. In order to construct this table manually in your own notebook, all you need to do is create first a rectangle, and once you have created the rectangle, connect the extreme points on the diagonals and then join the midpoints of the sides. Once you've done this, you would have divided the rectangle into 12 almost equal parts, though the equality is not that important for us, but we need to have 12 divisions and they need to look in this fashion. And regardless of the number here, this will always represent house number 1, house number 2, house number 12, house number 11. I hope this is at the moment clear to you. Now let us understand what does this house loosely mean. So we will first ignore the planets that are inside each of these houses for now. We are only learning what the houses actually mean. So the house number 1 is said to represent the person himself, that is, it is you. And often you will find a lot of astrologers use the word lagna. And lagna in Hindi basically means what the Western astrologers would call is the ascendant, that is the individual who was born or is rising at the time. So the first house represents you, and it is okay if this house is blank, because the process of making interpretations is significantly different. But the first critical step is to understand what each of these houses mean. And of all the 12 houses, the first house is the most critical because it actually represents the person themselves. Often, when you're looking at the first house, you're trying to see that there should not be significant afflictions to that house so as to keep the person healthier. Any negative impact here could impact a person's health, mental well-being, vitality, stamina. And this is also the house of identity. This is how you identify yourself, and this is how others identify you. So the first house is perhaps one of the most critical houses, or actually is the most critical house in this entire horoscope, because it is actually the person of whose horoscope it is. So an addition point here as a part of our theory is that the first house represents the east direction. So just like how an atlas is a 2D representation of the globe, similarly this kundali is the 2D representation of the globe or the earth. And and what this represents here is the east direction. Now let's look at the fourth house. The fourth house represents the person's heart, and the fourth house in family relations represents the individual's mother. The fourth house is the house of happiness and the house of joy. It is the house of luxury, ancestral wealth, vehicles, and all kinds of comfort. A very strong fourth house also gives the individual academic excellence. Having such a strong fourth house generally implies that the individual will be happy. So once again, this number 4 represents Cancer. In this case, however, I could just as well change the order and put some other zodiac in this house. Next, key point to remember here is that this represents the north of the entire horoscope. That is, this is representing the north direction of the globe. Much like the first house represents the east, the fourth house represents the north. Next, we will go to the seventh house. The seventh house is the house of intimacy. It is the house of close relationships, partnerships, recognition, and even and even business relationships. In fact, this house represents any written agreement, signed contract, any prize or certificate. It also represents your spouse because a marriage is typically considered an legal agreement between two individuals. So, where the first house is you, the seventh house is your wife or your husband, depending. In general, the first house is the person, the fourth house is the mother, the seventh house is the spouse. The first house represents the person, the attitude of the person, the vitality of the person, the image of the person. The fourth house represents what the person loves and the general comfort and luxury that the person achieves in life or experiences in life. The seventh house represents the recognition given to a person and all sorts of relationships, intimate and contractual relationships that an individual gets into. This is also seen as the house of business partnerships. And this represents the west in the entire horoscope. So once again, we have covered east, north and west in houses number 1, 4 and 7. Let's discuss the 10th house. The 10th house represents the south direction of the horoscope. And this is the house of duty, responsibility, name, fame. In general, your attitude towards work and career and all social responsibilities that you undertake are represented by this house. Generally, one could say that this represents your profession, but a single individual could have multiple professions. By profession, I mean a wider description of profession. That is, a person who is a doctor could also be a parent, could also be a child, could also be a neighbor, could also be a friend, and so on and so forth. In other words, you as the person have a core responsibility at your work, have a core responsibility to the people who are around you, and have a core responsibility to people who are around them. That role and responsibility which you undertake, which forms your set of duties towards each of them. For example, you have certain set of responsibilities towards your mother, certain set towards your father, certain towards your wife or husband, certain towards your children, certain towards your friends, and so on. All of this is basically seen from the 10th house. And of course, 10th house predominantly also represents career, which means individuals who are looking towards questions regarding their career, one generally sees the status of this house. And this, obviously, as I mentioned, represents the south direction of the chart. These 4 points, which are the east, north, west and south, the cardinal points are called as the Kendra houses of any chart. This word will be important because much of Vedic astrology literature, even if it is written in English, will use these common Sanskrit and Hindi words because it is derived from the text and most effectively represented by the text in most cases. So once again, the first 4, 7 and 10 represents the cardinal points, or what we will call as Kendra points. And the general rule is all the Kendra points are almost certainly auspicious. That is, these 4 houses are auspicious houses. Now, once this is done, let's look at the 5th house. The 5th house of a chart represents that what we love. It represents flirting. It represents success at a very, very wide scale. It represents, that is, it represents fame. It represents our ability to solve complex problems. It is also considered to be the house of our past life, which means all the good deeds that we have done in our past life are channeled to a particular aspect to the horoscope. In order to see where it is channeled, all we need to do is check where the Lord of this house is residing. So once again, the 5th house is basically the house of all good deeds done in the past, which help us gain name and fame, which help us solve complex problems, and most importantly, help us solve the problems of other people. It also is the house of falling in love, of flirting and feeling young. It's a very auspicious house, and having a strong fifth house generally also gives the person a lot of speculative success. Individuals who are looking at trading or gambling or betting in general, playing poker, or anything which gives speculative success, that is abrupt success, typically are venturing in this house. And if this house is connected with the house of duty in some manner, which I will teach subsequently, generally you will find these individuals predisposed towards taking speculative activity in order to perhaps earn a living. After this fifth house, I would like to now discuss the ninth house. Here, it's represented by the number 9, and you can see that I brought the cursor at this house. Now, where the first house represents you, the fourth house represents your mother, the fifth house represents your lover and also your children, the seventh house represents your spouse, business partners, the 10th house represents your seniors at workplace and authoritative figures. The 9th house represents your father, teachers, mentors, and father figures. The 9th house is actually called the Bhagya house. By Bhagya, we mean good fortune, not fate. This Bhagya house, this house basically governs or single-handedly determines how lucky or in general unlucky a person will be. Having a strong 9th house makes you feel very fortunate in life. Wherever this lord of the 9th goes, it is there that you will either gain or you will give a lot of good fortune to. Having a strong 9th house also makes the individual very predisposed towards spirituality, that is traveling for pilgrimage, visiting temples. So where having a 5th house which is active either due to strength or due to dasha or due to various reasons, the individual is generally predisposed towards chanting of mantras. Whereas in the 9th house, the individual will take the physical effort required to travel to remote places even for pilgrimage. In general, the 5th house and the 9th house are considered to be extremely auspicious, and the 1, 5, 9 are called as the trikon, almost implying a triangle or 3 points. You may note that house number 1 is also a cardinal point, that it is also a kendra, and it is also a trikon. Therefore, this house is the most auspicious of all houses. Next to follow are houses 5 and 9. The trikon houses are the most auspicious houses of any chart. 4, 7 and 10 follow next in order in degrees of auspiciousness. Now, let's discuss the second house. The second house is called as the house of wealth. In Hindi, you will often hear astrologers say Dhan, Vani, Kutumb. The second house literally represents your face, your and everything that a person engages in the face with. For example, speaking. For example, eating and drinking. And generally, even activities like singing are covered in this house. Having a strong second house generally implies that the person will have a very good family after marriage. Once again, this is the house of Dhan, Vani, Kutum, which means money, liquid cash, the cash that is available in the bank to spend. That is what we mean here by Dhan. Vani means speech, and the speech used for speaking, for teaching, for singing, that is individuals having a good strong second house or an active second house due to the dashas of certain planets will likely be earning through their speech in some way. This also represents Kutumb, Kutumb implies your family. So where 1 is you, 4 is your mother, 5 is your child, 7 is your spouse, 9 is your father, 10 are your seniors. The second house represents your family in totality, the family that you stay with, typically after marriage, particularly for girls, for women. This is essentially the wealth house. If in any way the first lord is connected to the second house, typically such individuals are family oriented. They are particular perhaps about their eating habits, and having liquidity to spend is of key importance to them. That is, having money to spend is of paramount importance to them. Combinations of the second house with auspicious houses such as 1, 4, 7, 10, 5, 9 typically result in the formation of what we call as the Dhan Yoga in any chart. Whereas combination of auspicious houses, that is 1, 4, 7, 10 with 1, 5, 9 in any way typically result in a Raj Yoga of any chart. What are combinations? These combinations we will discuss in subsequent videos. I will teach you how to identify them relatively quickly. After the second house, I would like you to focus on the 11th house. This is the house of fulfillment of all desires. This is the house of expansion. This is the house of gains. This is the house in which you defeat your enemies. And this is the house of your elder brother or elder sibling. This is the house in which we can identify the strength of your networks. That is, people who are higher than you in the social hierarchy. Individuals who are connected, that is, their first house is connected with their 11th house, are typically individuals who are again focused on expanding in life, growing in life. Their purpose is to fulfill all of their desires. They are very keen on networking with individuals who are socially at a very high rank and take great pride in such networks and use these networks very resourcefully. They are not shy to ask for help from these networks if obviously this house is positive. What happens if this house is negative? The exact opposite of what was discussed. The individual, even though having a lot of potential, does not care about growth, does not care about wealth, does not maintain cordial relations with people higher up in social hierarchy. So in the perfect world, we would obviously like a balance of everything. But of course, the purpose of assessing a chart is to identify if there is weakness in any particular house and what could be the potential impact. Because each house also represents a part of the body. For example, the 11th house represents the shin. So an extremely weak 11th house could even cause an injury to that part of the body. Generally, a single house will represent 3 broad categories of elements. In Hindi, they will call them as Jeev, Dhatu and Mool, where Jeev means life, Dhatu means material, and Mool means philosophy. So each house has a life associated with it, that is the individual's part of the body, and a life of some other individual is associated with it, which means, let's assume your birth chart has a very strong 11th house. Typically, your elder sibling will benefit a lot after your birth. And this potential will on the surface seem wasted if you do not have an elder sibling. So once again, I'll just repeat the houses that we have discussed. We have discussed the cardinal points or the kendras, which are 1, 4, 7, 10, which are considered to be auspicious houses. We have discussed the trikons, which are 1, 5 and 9, which are the extremely auspicious houses. Any combination any relation or any combination of the kendra and the trikon will result in a Raj Yoga. Houses 2 and 11 represent wealth. Any combination of these auspicious houses with these houses will give a Dhan Yoga. Now, let's look at the difficult houses on the chart. Starting with house number 3. House number 3 is the house of courage. It is recognized as the Parakram Bhav. It is that house through which we gain the courage to go to battle, the courage to pursue things that we truly desire. And it is also the house which makes us work extremely hard. This third house represents your neighbors. It also represents your colleagues who are at the same social hierarchy as you. It represents your younger siblings. It represents your friends and your peers. So the third house is also the house of fun and frolic. Having a good third house typically makes the individual witty, humorous, spontaneous, and actually fun-loving. It also makes the individual brave, courageous, and not afraid to work hard. Typically, such individuals lead from the front, create everything by themselves, and show enormous reserves of energy. So having a good third house makes you work hard, and as there is the adage, the harder you work, the luckier you get. Because always remember, the 7th house in a chart represents intimacy. The third house here is representing hard work, and 7 houses away is the 9th house, which is the house of good fortune or luck. So the relation between the 3rd and the 9th is that of intimacy, which means if ever you want to increase the element of luck in your life, astrology suggests you work hard. So it's a very useful concept to know that all houses which are 7 houses away from you or from the corresponding house will represent intimacy of that particular house. So the third house, however, is also a difficult house, and the reason is because it makes you work very hard. Any afflictions here and the person meaninglessly travels to and fro in the city and achieves very little. Also, such person could get into quarrels, fights, arguments. So therefore, the third house makes you, given that it makes you work extremely hard, and also because of a certain relation that it is 8th from the 8th, which I will come to later. It's a concept called Bhavat Bhavam, which we will discuss much later. The third house is considered to be a challenging one. But the real challenging houses are actually the 6th house, the 12th house, and the 8th house. By real challenging, I mean that they are termed as Dusthana houses or bad places of a chart. So the 6th house literally implies Rog, Rin, and Shatru, which means this is the house of disease, this is the house of debt, this is the house of enemies. In general, this is the house of competition. This is also the house of service and servitude. Individuals whose first house is connected with the second house, is with the 6th house strongly, or the 6th connected with the first strongly, generally tend to excel in careers related to medicine, banking, and law, largely because this house represents Rog, which means disease, Rin, which means debt, and Ripu or Shatru, which means enemies. This also makes the person, that is, if the Lord of the first is in the 6th house, very competitive, and gives them a strong desire to excel in competitive exams or competitive sports based on their predisposition. This house also represents animals to some extent. And I would also like to just add a concept here. Remember that I told you that the first house is you, and if you go 1, 2, 3 places away, you reach the house of your younger siblings, correct? That is, this is you, and going 3 places away represents your siblings. Similarly, the 4th house represents your mother, and going 3 places away, you reach the 6th house, which represents her siblings. It is by that reason This is the house we use to identify your maternal uncles, that is your mother's siblings, cousins, friends, etc. In general, because of the potential of this house to give the individual a disease, to set the individual back in debt, to set up the individual again that the person lends money and the borrower defaults, to give the individual enemies, to give the individual the responsibility to serve animals, and in general gives the individual a very competitive mindset. This house overall is considered to be of a difficult nature, and largely because serious afflictions to this house could either cause defeat in a court case which would be significant, or it could cause some sort of temporary illness which persists for a very long time. For example, having asthma, having rhinitis or hay fever, some kind of an allergy. They are most common sixth house symptoms. Let's look at the 12th house. The 12th house represents the in Hindi it is called as the Vay Bhav. Vay means expense. Now, expense is of two types. One is the money that you spend in order to create assets. Two would be the money that you spend in order to purchase things which enhance your quality of life. This house represents expense of all kinds. In other words, if by any chance one's house of career or profession or house of skill acquired in the previous life goes and gets connected with this house, it gives the individual a unique edge when it comes to investing, because remember, you need to spend in order to either create asset which has the potential of giving long term earning, or to create material goods and services which enhance your quality of life. This is seen by the 12th house. The 12th house also shows something which is completely different from what we discussed here. That is where we earlier discussed about spending money to enhance quality of life and spending money in order to create assets. The 12th house also represents spending money as donation. The 12th house in general represents isolation. It represents distance, far away. So if you remember that we are actually looking at a circle, this would be one of the farthest points from the starting one. The far in terms of degrees. This house therefore represents isolation. If this house is afflicted, it could even represent prison sentence or mental asylums. If the lord of the first house is connected with the 12th house in some way, such individuals could be absolutely great spenders. They could have great taste in fashion. They could also make great decisions regarding to investments. Such individuals also have the potential of either settling abroad or earning from foreign resources through export or import businesses. Such individuals would naturally be great healers. That is, more the number of planets which are channeled in this particular house, the more energy this individual should, when these planets trigger due to their corresponding Mahadashas and Antardashas, the individual should generally consider attempting to heal other people. This will be the house of many psychologists, of many individuals who provide consultative therapy at some level. So with this, the only house that is remaining is the 8th house. The 8th house is called as the Mrityu or the Ayu Bhav. It determines to some extent or to a great extent the longevity of a person's life. But in general, the 8th house is said to be a mysterious house, because the 8th house covers everything that is under the earth and above the sky. By everything under the earth, we would imply things like metals, mining them, polishing them, distributing them. And above the sky, we would look at things such as space technology, telecom, internet, etc. So therefore, if the first lord goes and gets connected with the eighth in some positive way, it could either give the individual great success with metal mining and trading, or it could make the individual highly successful in fields of research as well, because the eighth house represents the depth of life and eighth house represents research as well. So individuals who have a strong eighth house typically experience great longevity in life. Having a strong eighth house gives so much of longevity to life that there is a probability that your name will exist long after you're gone. That is, it will exist and be remembered and cherished by a large number of people long after you're gone. Famous personalities such as Amitabh Bachchan or Albert Einstein, they will show a strong eighth house, because for generations after they have gone or they will go, or after their passing, they are likely to be remembered as one of the greats in the industry. Another thing which is beneath the earth and above the sky are gemstones, as I discussed, and astrology as a subject itself, largely because we are looking at planets and their positions in order to make reasonable inferences for our day-to-day life. In this video, my objective was to give you an overview of the 12 houses of a kundali. Key points being that the first house is always represented by this box, so to speak, and this box represents the east direction regardless of the number that is here. Once again, this is the first house, and the number 1 just indicates that since the first house represents the body of the person, we could say that the body of this person is Aries, that is, this person is Aries ascendant. Similarly, I could have this as the first house, and you will note that in the first house where the question mark is given, which implies the ascendant or the lagna, you will see number 7 is written, which implies that such a child is actually a Libran. Similarly, I could change this and make this into the first house, and then such a child would be an Aquarian, because Aquarius is the 11th zodiac of the 12. So students, in order for the subsequent session to be meaningful, I encourage you to revise from sources available online on the description of the 12 houses, and if possible try to memorize the 12 zodiacs in order. It will be a huge advantage to you as you go on learning. So it will be great if you read upon the description of all houses and you suggest on what you would like to study more. Largely, the intention that I have in mind is that for the subsequent sessions to be more meaningful, you might as well as study as much theory as possible, starting from houses, memorizing all the 12 zodiacs, and if possible also memorize who is the ruler of that zodiac. For example, for house number 1, it will always, for house number 1, if there is Aries will always be ruled by Mars, Taurus by Venus, Gemini by Mercury, 4 is the Cancer, that is Moon, 5 will be Leo, that is Sun, and so on. Also note that excepting Sun and Moon, all planets own 2 houses, and Rahu and Ketu, which are the north and the south pole of the moon, do not fully own any house. They are just co-lords with Mars and Saturn, that is, Saturn and Mars respectively, Rahu with Saturn and Ketu with Mangal. So I hope that this video gives you some direction on your preparation process further. I will look forward to your suggestions on what topics you would like me to cover. Otherwise, the topics that in general I have in mind are to discuss the 12 zodiacs, their ascendant lords, and give certain characteristics about those ascendant lords, and eventually the zodiac itself. I wish you all the best in your study of Vedic Jyotish.